Hi, everybody. Good morning. How's everybody doing? Good. Ready for an exciting topic and a lively discussion? Okay. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rafeeq Hasan. He comes to Amherst from the University of Chicago, where he not only taught, but he also matriculated for both his undergraduate and graduate degrees. Hassan's research interests include political and social dimensions of freedom from both a historical and contemporary perspective, which I'm sure we'll learn more about in this talk. At Amherst, Hassan has taught classes on ethics, morality, and justice, and please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you. So there's a handout going around. There's not going to be a test afterwards. The handout is just so you can track my talk. And the basic theme of the talk today is on what one might call the philosophy of distributive justice, which is basically the idea of who gets what and why, right? And actually, before we get into all the philosophy stuff, and so the plan is today I'm going to talk for about half an hour. In fact, I'm going to talk for exactly half an hour. I've set an alarm on my phone, so when the half hour goes off, I'm just going to stop, which will leave half hour for us to all have a conversation. But before we get into the philosophy stuff and before we get into the handout and all that, I actually want to start with two YouTube clips, which are probably things you have seen in the past, but we're going to try to revisit them in a new light. So I know it's a little bright outside, but I hope you can at least see okay, and the clips won't be particularly long. So I'm going to start with a short clip of a famous speech from Obama, that often gets called the "You didn't build that" speech. So let's start with that.
If you've been successful, you didn't get there on your own. You didn't get there on your own. I'm always struck by people who think, well, it must be because I was just so smart. There are a lot of smart people out there. It must be because I worked harder than everybody else. Let me tell you something. There are a whole bunch of hard-working people out there. If you were successful, somebody along the line gave you some help. There was a great teacher somewhere in your life. Somebody helped to create this unbelievable American system that we had that allowed you to thrive. Somebody invested in roads and bridges. If you got a business, you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen. The internet didn't get invented on its own.
Okay, so let me just, so that's the Obama clip, a speech that famously got him into, that phrase alone, "You didn't build that," famously got him into a lot of hot water. And now here is, it's a slightly longer clip. Here is an ad that was an attack ad against Obama from the Mitt Romney campaign.
If you've been successful, you didn't get there on your own. If you didn't get there on your own, I'm always struck by people who think, well, it must be because I was just so smart. There are a lot of smart people out there. It must be because I worked harder than everybody else. Let me tell you something. If you got a business, you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen.
My father's hands didn't build this company. My hands didn't build this company. My son's team's not building this company. Did somebody else take out the loan on my father's house to finance the equipment? Did somebody else make payroll every week to figure out where it's coming from? President Obama, you're killing us out here. With hard work and a little bit of luck, we built this business. Why are you demonizing us for it? We are the solution, not the problem. It's time to get somebody who believes in us. Someone who believes that achievement should be rewarded, not punished. We need somebody who believes in America.
The idea to to say that Steve Jobs didn't build Apple, that Henry Ford didn't build Ford Motor. To say something like that is not just foolishness, it's insulting to every entrepreneur, every innovator in America, and it's wrong. President Obama attacks success, and therefore under President Obama we have less success, and I will change that.
Great, I'm done with the clips. So, so what you see here, I think, is in fact a debate. I mean, these guys aren't professors or whatever, but what you see here is a debate that I think goes quite deep into the philosophy of what, again, I said at the beginning, you might call the philosophy of distributive justice, right? And you might say that the Obama view, you didn't build that, places the notion of cooperation at the front, right? And the attack ad, which the response to the idea that you didn't build that is, no, in fact, I did build that, right? Is channeling a conception of distributive justice as being primarily about entitlements. And so, in fact, I think Obama here is, in fact, channeling the philosophy of John Rawls. From a few biographies I've read, it turns out that, in fact, he's probably doing it quite explicitly. And what Romney is doing here is, in fact, channeling, though I don't know too much about him, so it could be only, it might not be explicit, it might be implicit, but he's channeling the philosophy of Robert Nozick. Now, just to show you that I'm going to try to give you a brief overview of things that are in fact very complex, I brought both books. As you can see, they're quite big, so so we're just gonna hit the highlights here. So here's what Rawls says at the beginning of his work, A Theory of Justice. I'm just going to read this quote, which is why you have the handout. He says, "So let us assume, to fix ideas," the idea being this is the starting point, that society is a more or less self-sufficient association of persons who, in their relations to one another, see certain rules of conduct as binding, and who, for the most part, act in accordance with those rules. Suppose further that these rules specify a system of cooperation designed to advance the good of those taking part in it. And here's a famous phrase from Rawls: a society is a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. So I take it there that that's really a fancy way of saying what Obama says, you didn't build that, right? Anything that looks like an individual contribution is actually bound up in a very complicated idea of cooperation for social advantage. Now, in fact, Rawls goes much, much farther than Obama does in this speech. There are certain things that are in the view of Rawls that I don't think anyone, if you said those out loud, could ever run for office in the U.S. And here are two thoughts. So the way in which Rawls goes much, much farther is he has this conception of deserved versus undeserved good luck. So his idea, so this is on the handout, he says that if you're trying to figure out the principles of distributive justice, again, who gets what and why, you have to think about the following thought. So he says here that what justice is, quote, a fair agreement on the basis of which those better endowed or more fortunate in their social position, neither of which we can be said to deserve, could expect the willing cooperation of everyone else when some workable scheme is needed for the welfare of all. So the basic thought here is our starting points in society, what families we were born into, how much advantage we were born into, is in fact undeserved. You didn't choose to be born into a particular environment, right? And in fact, when I go through this stuff almost every year, almost all of my students agree with that there's something arbitrary about what families you were born into. But then he says a thing that almost none of my students agree with. In fact, they're all sort of horrified by, because here they are at this elite school. His thought is, if your social position in life, what families you're born into is undeserved, then he says the following, it's written in this kind of, in the cool prose of a Harvard professor, the calm prose, but it's actually quite inflammatory. He says, there's no more reason to permit the distribution of income and wealth to be determined by the distribution of natural assets than by historical and social fortune. Even the willingness to make an effort to try and so to be deserving in the ordinary sense is itself dependent upon happy family and social circumstances. So the thought is, if our social position in life is undeserved, you didn't choose to be born into, let's say, an affluent family, he says that even things that look like your natural talents are themselves just a matter of undeserved good luck, even your ability to work hard, to try hard. Right? And that's the moment at which 98% of my students sort of sign off. Right? But what he gets from this basic idea of undeserved luck is a principle of economic justice. This is at the bottom of page 1 of your handout, that he calls the difference principle. I won't explain why that strange term, but the idea is that, he says, in a just society, we're trying to figure out who gets what and why. He says that inequalities in income, right, the fact that some people earn so much more than another, could be justified only to the extent that they benefit the least well-off people in society. So his basic thought here is there are certain sorts of jobs, for instance, being a doctor, being a business entrepreneur even, let's say, there's all kinds of jobs that in fact raise the social pie and make all of us better off, including those who are worst off. And there's a certain degree, I mean, say you want to be a doctor, right? You have to go to, there's a lot of schooling, there's a lot of hard work, right? The idea is you might not be incentivized to do that unless you're paid more, right? But his thought is it's only that kind of incentive structure that could justify anyone earning more than anyone else. So that's a radicalized version of the Obama speech. Right. So now I want to turn to the attack ad, right? And here I think what Romney is doing is channeling a philosophy from Robert Nozick. It turns out that Rawls and Nozick at Harvard were right down the hall from each other. They were good friends, but they articulate opposite views of all of these things. So here's Nozick's starting point. It's not about individual cooperation, right? Here's Nozick's starting point. He says, individuals have rights, and there are things no person or group may do to them without violating their rights. So strong are these rights that they raise the question of what, if anything, the state and its officials may do. So I want to call this a freedom-based view. The idea is that assume individuals are free, and if they're free, they have certain rights and entitlements. And Nozick comes along and says, by what right could this thing called the state do anything to us? By what right could it coerce us in any way? And his view of distributive justice, right, who gets what and why, is what he calls the entitlement theory, right? And so he says here, I have 2 quotes from Nozick. He says, whatever arises from a just situation by just steps is itself just. So that might seem abstract. So here's another quote that maybe fleshes it out a little more. He says, whoever makes something having bought or contracted for all other held resources used in the process, is entitled to it. The thought is not about something's getting made and there being an open question of who is to get it. Things come into the world already attached to people having them. And I think that's exactly what the Mitt Romney attack ad says. That owner says, look, I didn't commit any crimes. I took out the loan, right, on my house, right? I haven't done anything wrong by the rules of the game. So by what right could you take away what I've earned from that? And that's a Nozickian entitlement theory. Now, in the same way that Rawls goes much, much, much farther than Obama, I think Nozick goes much, much, much farther than Romney, but in two surprising ways. So one way in which he goes farther than Mitt Romney is he simply says that the implications of his argument is that taxation is theft. So he says, this is on the handout, taxation of earnings from labor is on par with forced labor. Right? The idea is like it's just a form of stealing from you. I spent a day going through some of the things that Mitt Romney has said about taxation, and I don't see any such view that he's ever articulated. He might think that the existing structure of taxation is unjust, but I've never seen him say that it's theft. So that's one way in which you might say Nozick goes farther than Rawls. But there's another much more surprising way in which Nozick goes, that you might say he goes further than Romney. But there's another surprising way in which he goes much farther that is often very surprising to my students who come in having kind of Nozickian views. For Nozick, the historical backstory of how you acquired anything matters. Historical injustice matters. So if there's injustice in the history of how things are acquired, he says, this is on the handout, the principle of rectification comes into play. The idea that there's something that was wrong that needs to be made right. And so he says in one page of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and as far as I can tell, none of the Tea Party people who are so influenced by this book ever cite this page. He says this striking thing. He says, so perhaps it is best to view Rawlsian principles as rough rules of thumb meant to approximate the general results of applying the principles of rectification of injustice. The idea being, because the process by which things have been acquired are unjust, we might actually need a kind of quite radical redistribution at least one time to sort of right that wrong. And then he says in a footnote, which again, I've never seen. I bring this up to my students who come in and they're like shocked by this footnote. He says, although to introduce socialism as a punishment for our sins would be to go too far, past injustices might be so great as to make needed in the short run a more extensive state in order to rectify them. So the same person who says, by what right could the state do anything to you, ends up by saying, well, if there's a lot of historical injustice in the past, we may need a more extensive state at least once. Right. So as far as I can tell, no one ever discusses that page and knows it. But so actually what I want to claim today, and yes, great, I'm right on time, is to say that in the political sphere, right, if you go out of the classroom, this debate between sort of cooperation and fairness-based views on one hand and entitlement-based views on the other is at an impasse, right? I mean, on one hand, a fairness or cooperation view gets you the idea that there needs to be some kind of economic redistribution in America, but it's based on a starting assumption, this idea of social cooperation, you didn't build that. That is, a lot of people just don't accept. They say, yes, I did build that. Who are you to tell me I didn't build that? And the freedom and entitlement-based view makes it very hard to see, as Nozick himself says, how we're going to get beyond the notion that taxation is theft. So my project, my work, in fact, is to try to think about how we might articulate a redistributive view based on starting assumptions that are not as controversial as the kind of you didn't build that view. And here I'm going to draw on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, but not the moral philosophy, the thing that a few of you, if there's any people here who were philosophy students, you may have read this text that Kant wrote called The Groundwork for the Physics of Morals, already a weighty title, but actually a text that's in fact far more obscure than even that, that Kant wrote entitled The Doctrine of Right. And here the notion of the German word for right basically means law. So I'm going to draw on Kant's philosophy of law. So I'm going to give you an argument. This is on page 3 of the handout. Right. It's a little complicated, but I tried to boil it down to its essentials, and I also tried to not cite anything from Kant, because it's very German. So here's how I think the argument works. So assume that individuals, you and I, are all free. But don't think of this freedom primarily in terms of freedom of choice. I'm free insofar as I get to, do what I want, choose what I want. Think of this freedom as established in relation to one another. So think of the basic thought of freedom as I'm free insofar as I'm not dominated by anybody else. So the basic thought here is I'm free if you aren't the boss of me. Right? And at the very least, you're not being the boss of me means that you don't have the right to screw with my body, to enslave me, right? You don't have the right to mess with me. Take that as the starting point. But it's not just that you don't have the right to mess with me. The idea is take it as a mutual construction of this freedom. Nobody is the boss of anybody else. Nobody has the right to mess with anyone else. So take that as your starting point. Kant has tortuously long arguments for why that should be the starting point. I won't get into them now. Just take it as the starting point, right? And then he says, well, look, as equally free beings, as beings no one has the right to screw with, right? We each actually have an entitlement to own property. We can extend the sphere of our right from our bodies out to external objects in the world. Why? Well, because if doing so does not interfere with other people's bodies, then by step 1 in the argument, by what principle could I be prevented? So how could, right? If ownership doesn't interfere with your body, then what could prevent me from being a rightful owner? But now things get a little complicated. I apologize for that, but there's no way. You can only boil Kant down so much, right? He says, look, all this establishes is the possibility of a property right. We all know from the fact that we're free beings that it must be possible for us to have property. So I don't need a state to know that free individuals have some right to own things. Possibility. But actually acquiring property is a different matter. By what right could I claim this chair as mine? That particular chair. Say, it's mine. Because after all, if it's mine, then that means I can rightfully restrict what other people can do with that chair. If I say the chair is mine, then it means that I can rightfully say, you can no longer sit in that chair. Right? But the thought is, by what right could we do that? right? By step one in the argument, we're all equally free beings. So we seem to have to run into a dilemma. We know we have the possibility of owning property, but we don't know how to make that claim actually. We don't know how to actually own something. So he says by step four, the only way to rightfully acquire property is in fact to create a state. So I'll say here, I'll just quote one line of Kant. He says, only in a civil condition can something external, that chair, right, be mine or yours. So the notion is that the state creates the conditions under which Jack's binding Jill to respect Jack's property right also binds Jill to respect Jack's property right. It creates the conditions for mutuality. It allows each of us to acquire property in a way that doesn't interfere the idea that no one is the boss of anyone else. But remember, the state, on Kant's view, is tasked with ensuring equal freedom, i.e. that nobody's the boss of anybody else. That was the starting principle in the sequence of argument that I'm trying to give you. So, Kant says, if some people start to own too much, they'll come to dominate other people. Here's a simple example. If I own all the land, I own all the space in this room, I'm the owner of it. I can rightfully exclude other people from it. Then all of you have to depend on my goodwill, on my permission for you to be anywhere at all. So he says, and this is what I find so neat, this is why I've spent the last 3 years trying to think about 9 paragraphs of text. So, honestly, 9 paragraphs. He says, look, acquiring property could only be consistent with the equal freedom of all if the state ensures that I don't have to depend on other people for the continued conditions of my freedom. So he gives the examples of things like homelessness. If I'm homeless, then I literally have no place I can rightfully be except by the permission of another. I have to depend on other people to be somewhere. So he gives the examples of homelessness, the examples of abject poverty, etc. So he says, the freedom-protecting state. Remember, we just started with the notion of individuals and their rights. Nobody's the boss of anybody else. He says the freedom-protecting state requires basic welfare protections. It requires universal health care, right to housing, a right to a living wage, and this, of course, is going to demand some redistribution from the rich to the poor. So the upshot is, that's so interesting, is that the very same principle that justifies individuals in acquiring entitlements to property, that was Nozick, also justifies the state in redistributing resources when needed. Rawls. Uniting the two, one might say, dialectically. Probably the wrong crowd to get into that, right? Right. So the hinge principle here is one of freedom as non-domination. No one is the boss of anybody else. And so what Kant would say is not that taxation is theft, but that private acquisition without public taxation would be theft. You're really, in that sense, stealing the freedom of other people. So my hope for today, and I'm actually done, so I didn't take the full half an hour, is that this might provide a new framework for public deliberation about distributive justice, who gets what and why. Since it begins from a premise that a libertarian can accept, individuals, their rights, no one's the boss of anyone else, and argues from those to relatively modest, I would say, social justice conclusions. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I think before we open it up for questions, thank you so much, Professor Hassan. That was a great overview of economic justice. And I don't know if this is a coincidence or if you planned it as a philosophical exercise, but we've run out of our finite resources, which are those handouts. So despite your feeling on all of this, if you wouldn't mind maybe sharing or passing your handout to someone who hasn't been able to.
There's two more.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, no, I actually probably need one. in case
Okay.
I pass me.
Okay. So somebody can refer to it. I know that there are a lot of quotes. So again.
I apologize for that. I didn't know.
Right,
I didn't do it on purpose.
Yes. Okay. And I think that if you don't mind, we'll open it up for questions.
Yep.
Perfect.
So I'll let you call
One
it.
of these or you need question. Okay, great. Go ahead.
So very good work. I would like to know how scarcity as a dimension figures into it, and particularly the idea between there is a fixed pie that can't be expanded versus the idea that there is a pie that can be expanded.
Mm-hmm. Good. So I think, yeah, so it's very important for Rawls that the way in which what he thinks he's trying to do is bring some kind of socialist ideas into what ultimately he thinks is a capitalist framework. Is he says, look, clearly it's not a fixed sum of goods. Like clearly innovation, entrepreneurship, all of these things can expand the total social pie and make and improve the lives of all, right? And he's quite clear that he says state-planned economies don't allow for that as much. We need a market, right? But his thought is, so the Rawls thought is, given all of these things about the arbitrariness of your starting points, the arbitrariness of your natural talents, he says the only thing that could make it okay for those entrepreneurs, right, to get paid more is if they're doing so increases the total social product and in fact makes things better for the worst off. And he says that the worst off, for the viewpoint of his theory, he says count it as the person who makes minimum wage. So the only thing that could justify higher earnings of some is that if it improves the position of those at the bottom. The Kant argument, I think, is really interesting in that Kant has entirely a freedom-based view. And he says at the beginning of the doctrine of right that need plays no role in his account. So for Kant, scarcity doesn't matter, right? I mean, he does say, here's the only way in which scarcity matters. He says, none of my account would apply if the earth was an infinite plane and not a globe. And the thought is, because it's a globe, we can come into contact. We can't just spread out and ignore each other. Our bodies can come into contact, right? And so for Kant, even if things are not scarce, even if there's only two of us in the room and there's all these chairs, there's still the question, by what right, if you and I are equally free beings, can I say that chair is mine and exclude you from being able to sit in it? So Kant is, I think, very intriguing in that it is not a scarcity-based argument. Yes? I'll let you call on people. So, yeah.
Great. How about you in the back?
Yeah.
So I guess I just want to bring up the issue of the assumption that we're free and that nobody's the boss of anybody else. And I mean, you can look at look at developmental theory. I mean, parents are the boss of kids. Mm-hmm. Until, hopefully in a healthy family, the kids suddenly become equal until the parents get to be my age, and then it begins to shift again, and the kids become the boss of the parents. And so developmentally, in fact, I'm not sure that assumption's correct.
Yeah.
It's
Excellent.
only, there's just a temporary time when it may be correct, but in fact, we're not built to be free in that way.
Good. So I think Kant thinks developmentally and as a matter of human social relationality, of course, we're not these discrete little autonomous individuals. He thinks when it comes to our rights, where a right is something that I have the really entitlement to enforce. If I have a right to my body, it means that if you try to assault me, I can use force to get you off my body. Like, that's what a right means. So Kant actually says that because of these issues about family, about, for instance, the raising of children, and he also discusses the context of marriage, his philosophy of law has a very complicated discussion of family law. And the idea is, how do we manage the fact that in some sense we are the boss of our children, right? But that doesn't mean that we have infinite coercive power over them, right? The state can step in and say, no, you can't do that to your child. So Kant thinks that when we talk about rights, right, even parent-child relationships, he says we already get that there's some way in which children are, in fact, autonomous right-bearing beings, which is why the state can step in and have a very complicated construction of law of the family. Yeah.
On page 3, paragraph 2, I think it's a very weak argument because it's based on a rhetorical question.
Wait, sorry, page 2.
Page 3.
Page 3.
Paragraph 2, where it says that our right to control our own bodies and not be dominated by another can be then extended to the right to own external objects in the world. Because all it really says is by what principle could we be prevented from doing so. But you could say this may guarantee our right to use objects in the world. That's not the same as the right to own objects in the world. It's a very different kind of concept. Because if we use objects, other people may have the same right to use the same objects.
Yes.
But if we own objects, they lose that right.
Thank you. So I have now 48-page paper on that step in the argument. Right. And the thought is, yeah, doesn't this only establish something like what the lawyers would call usufruct, right? A scheme for communal use, right? And I guess the thought here is that, how do I sum up a 48 page? Okay, here's how. The thought is that if you're beginning with the notion of individuals and their rights, a notion of shared use is actually derivative from a notion of individual use. Because by what right could we decide that these objects are there for our communal use? So take like a bike sharing scheme, which you have in New York now with this, you have these bikes that you can rent and you can share, right? The thought is, well, originally, so that's all easy to understand because we're already in a state and it's up and going, right? But if we had a community of individuals, right, and we had some bikes, and we were like, well, let's just have a rule that we have a communal use, so it means that when I'm on the bicycle, you can't boot me off of the bicycle, right? But there's no sense in which the bicycle is mine, the bicycle is yours. The thought is, we could agree on that arrangement, right? But if you're going to have a Nozikian starting point, by what right does anyone else get to be the boss of me? It's actually conceptually, individual property rights are conceptually prior. They come in first. Individuals have to own things have rights to things, then they can collectively decide to share those things. I think that's Kant's argument.
What's the basis of that priority?
The basis of the priorities we're starting with the innate right to freedom, with each individual being able to say, you're not the boss of me. So by what right? So shared use would already imply a collective in view that has authority over me. So that's, but actually I think about 98% of the people who write on Kant's argument radically get it wrong because then they say, well, all the argument establishes is communal use. This is just ideology that he thinks that it implies private property. All he's saying is it implies property. He's got it wrong, and so we've been trying to figure out, well, maybe he's smarter than we think, and so then it's like, this is the best I can come up with.
With respect to that, there seems to me there's a distinction between property and ideas. You can have property and say this belongs to me, but there's nothing necessarily to prevent you to use that idea that created that property and do it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes,
I mean, there's some intellectual property limitations, but beyond that, there's a right to say, well, do it yourself.
Yes. So here, my answer is that it's a very complicated book, and there is a discussion of intellectual property that I don't yet understand, right? Yeah. So I mean, the thought would be, I don't really know what to say other than to say the thought would be that there's a way in which Kant says that this notion of ownership, like what I can kind of conclusively determine as mine, the ground case, the easiest case to understand is like actual objects in the world, like a chair. But there's a sense in which, so he says at one point, look, if I own the rights to a book, like if I wrote a book, he says there's a problem now. Because couldn't you come along and take with your own pen and paper, right, over here, and just write word for word for word my book, right? But now you could say, but now it's my book because I used my stuff, right? So he does say that, there's got to be more steps of this argument that somehow imply a right to ownership of one's deeds and of one's ideas, and not just ownership of the actual objects in the external world. And I think that might follow from the notion of a free being as being the author of its own actions. I'm sorry, that's a little obscure, but that's the best I got. Yeah.
What would these principles have to say about Google and Facebook, which seemingly have the opportunity to expand without limit or competition on the one hand, but on the other hand are seen as very much infringing upon other people's rights of expression?
Yeah, good. So I think this argument, this Kant argument, is going to be pretty clear and good about those kinds of cases, because those are going to look like monopoly cases, right? So the idea is that there's some sense in which those agents come to be like dominators of us. We depend on them, right? So in fact, I didn't bring this up, but there's a way in which Hayek, who's also, often thought of as a kind of conservative in some ways. Hayek actually has arguments very close to Kant. So he says, if there's a community that forms around like one source of water in an area, and it turns out that one person claims to own it. They're like, that's mine. Right? And everyone else in the community now has to, like, that's their only source, right? So they have to depend. They have whatever terms that guy gives, they have to meet those terms, right? Otherwise they'll die. Hayek even says that's illegitimate and that guy has no right to own the well. For the same sort of reasons, if the starting point is equal freedom, by what right could we all come to depend on that guy? Hayek's not like Kant, though, and this goes back to the first thing that was asked, is Hayek says that here, he's actually, in a weird way, a lot more like Aquinas. Here he says the problem is need. We need that H2O in order to survive. And I think that's an unstable half ground between thinking that need is the thing that gets the argument off the ground, or this notion of private dependence. I would say Kant goes all the way and says need doesn't matter.
Okay, how about you?
It's hard for me to imagine rights without responsibilities at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
For example, whether I'm rich or poor, if I choose to smoke cigarettes and I get lung cancer, why should I expect there to be universal health care?
Mm-hmm. Good, great. So, I think what's interesting about the Kant argument is it actually, what it gets you in terms of social justice protections is very minimal. Much less than what Rawls wants, which is radically redistributive. So Kant's account, I think, is that at some minimum level, individual responsibility and bad choices don't matter. So here's a thought that a philosopher named Elizabeth Anderson gives, which I think makes the same thought. She says, like, suppose there's an accident, right? And there's two people badly hurt by the side of the road, right? It turns out that, like, one of them was a drunk driver, right? So one person drove drunk and the other person was just hurt, right? She says, of course, there's later questions about if the drunk driver should be put in jail, what should happen to him. She says, at the moment, we don't think that the ambulance should just pick up the person who did no wrong and leave the drunk driver by the side of the road to die. There could be further downstream questions about the role of the fact that he made a bad choice. But at a minimum, right, so that would be the thought, that there's a minimum degree of protections that are in fact immune to this age-old debate between personal responsibility, the so-called deserving versus undeserving poor, all of that. Right. But it is important that the way in which I'm trying to use the Kant thing to sort of bridge this divide that we see between Obama and Romney is to say, what the Kant argument establishes, at least in the way I've presented it, is like minimal. Right? I myself think that Kant's an unstable halfway house, and if he really, really thought the conditions of non-domination, if he thought them all the way through, he should be Marx. But that's my own views, right? Yeah.
Okay, then you, sir.
Yeah.
Getting back to scarcity, we have situations where the state or perhaps City Hall creates the scarcity. We see a lot of pressures, I think, of the city of San Francisco from what I've read in the papers, where they, through the use of zoning laws, they restrict the utility or purpose of parcels of land. In some ways, you're levying to the extreme, I guess, almost a 100% tax on the property owner, and also you're not doing a lot of what was the phrase that you used in the first page? Cooperation and mutual advantage to society, I guess, where you're really harming some of the lower end wage earners and even the homeless people. So,
yep.
Talk more, I guess, about the responsibilities of the state, I suppose.
Well, in some sense, you've read my mind, because the other big project I'm doing is on the nature of gentrification, right, which is brought about in part by these zoning laws, right? I mean, in part. So a question in that work I have is, like, by what principles could you impose rent controls on landlords, right? I mean, it's my property, I own it, but what could you? So the thought would be that, I do want to say, so there's a sense in which I don't want to make it seem like, it could seem like from this handout, that the problem is just private domination, one individual depends on another, and then all of a sudden comes along this magical entity called the state, and it solves all the problems. Because then you might say, well, why is depending on the state any more free, on what the state tells me to do? Like, why is that any more free than depending on a particular individual? So I think what this argument establishes is that the state could only solve these problems of private dependence, right? If it's constructed in a certain way, if it's constructed really according to strong principles of democratic accountability. So the notion would be here that those zoning laws might be okay if there was a real sense in which all the people whose lives were constricted by them had a real vote. But if it's the case that the way those zoning laws work is that the real estate lobby has huge disproportionate power over how the laws get passed, then there's a sense in which so the very same argument that gives you an account of the necessity of the state for the conditions of freedom also gives you an account of how that state needs to be run in order to actually be not just another form of domination.
And you see the NIMBY phenomenon, I think, not in my backyard, is sewn into this as well.
Yeah. It's like, that's the thought that for me to own something, it's to neglect the thought that my ownership is located in a construction of mutual ownership, right? And it's to not care about what I do with my stuff might affect what you can do with your stuff. Like, there's a real problem. The not in my backyard thing literally produces conditions of homelessness in certain cases. Yeah.
I think we have time for one or two more.
I'll try not to blather on you. I fall back on my Amherst education, political science, Professor Latham. If he were standing where you are now, he would not tell us, he would ask us. And one of our discussions was about the social contract. As you said, we're not completely free. We had no choice of how or where we are born. And this goes back to the first agricultural revolution, Cain and Abel. Abel, the nomadic sheep herder, hunter-gatherer, Cain, the agriculturalist, tilled the soil and was incensed by the fact that Abel allowed his sheep to pass along through those fields. And what did he do about it? He killed Abel. Now it begins, the social contract.
It's a great example.
Beginning of property rights, because what was the alternative, Latham would say? Well, that's when we discussed anarchy. And so we have motivation inspired by acquisition, and a moral imperative also introduced to modify excess acquisition. And therein, he allowed us to conclude that the social contract is an evolving mechanism. And that finally brings me to the question my wife put in my head. She's a smithy. How does the social contract impact natural selection? Does it replace it?
I'm not sure what the question is, unfortunately.
Well, imagine we understand what natural selection is.
Uh-huh.
How is it impacted by the social contract?
Well, I mean, I think the social, I guess here's all I know how to say to that, is that, I mean, one of the thoughts of political philosophy that actually goes as far back as Plato, right? Is how do we, so there are all of these facts of natural finitude, the ways in which we can't satisfy our needs on our own, the way in which we come.
Can I just add one more thing? Because you're going in the direction I thought. The Black Plague. All of a sudden, all the workers, or a lot of the workers, were gone. And the peasants were now driving this economy. They get to call the shots. They get to decide how much they were going to make. They were in short supply. And interesting enough, the Renaissance began at that time.
Right, so the thought is that what political philosophy is a way of managing and deciding how we're going to respond to the facts of nature, right? And that's been true since, since at least Plato's Republic. So you get the same thought in Rawls. He says, look, it's a natural fact that certain people are just born with more intelligence than others. It's just a natural fact. He said we're right? But now what he says is what we need to do as a collection of free beings is to collectively decide what we are going to make of that natural fact. So, I just think that's the kind of age-old thought of political philosophy, and sort of I think what I've given you today is three sort of modern forms of that ancient thought.
Okay, one more, so I'll start back there. You.
To follow up on the tobacco, so a user makes a bad choice, gets a disease, what's the social ramifications of that? Do we have to give them universal health care? But what's the responsibility of the manufacturer that's producing a product that's guaranteed to give you a disease?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So, I do think that you could get the notion of state regulation of tobacco companies from, in fact, well, actually, what you're saying is interesting. Because Kant is so adamant about restricting needs from the argument, it does look, well, I suppose the thought would be that you produce a product on which people come to depend, right? I depend now because I'm addicted, right? And I guess the thought would be that the very same principle that allows you to make a product in the first place, to decide to produce tobacco products, the fact that you're an individual and no one should be the boss of you, means that if the product you produce makes it the case that you are in fact the boss of other people because other people come to depend on you, the very same principle that allows you to start the company also allows the state to come along and say, well, we're going to make a pack of smokes $500 now. So no one will buy them and you'll go under. What it probably doesn't quite let you do, again, this is the way in which Kant still believes in markets. I don't think it quite lets the state come in and say, you can't make this product because it's bad for people. What it can say is, you can make this product, but we can set the conditions under which you're not going to want to keep making the product.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have.
Thank you so much. Thanks.